I have watched enough regimes wobble to know the difference between noise and signal. And what is unfolding inside Iran now is not background static. It is a pattern that intelligence services are trained to detect, but too often choose to explain away. Protests erupting across more than 100 locations, accompanied by general strikes, internet blackouts, and the destruction of regime symbols, are not spontaneous outbursts. They are indicators of systemic stress. When analysts reduce them to complaints about inflation or fuel prices, they are not being cautious, they are being lazy. These demonstrations began, predictably, with economic pain. Iran's currency collapse and the erosion of purchasing power created the initial spark. That much is undeniable and publicly documented. But economic grievances alone do not sustain geographically dispersed protests in a security state. What sustains them is a loss of fear. Once that barrier erodes, repression becomes a blunt instrument rather than a stabilizing one. I learned early in my career that when a population begins openly defacing state symbols and defying security forces in multiple cities simultaneously, the regime's coercive credibility is already damaged. The Iranian government's response tells the real story. Emergency cash payments to households, roughly the equivalent of a few dollars a month, are not policy solutions. They are panic measures. No government confident in its control resorts to symbolic handouts while shutting down the internet and deploying riot units. These actions reflect internal assessments that the situation is volatile and potentially contagious. That is the signal intelligence officers are supposed to recognize. What makes this moment different from prior protest cycles is the convergence of pressures. Iran is not just economically strained, it is strategically overextended. Resources are flowing outward to sustain proxies and deterrence postures while domestic conditions deteriorate. That imbalance breeds resentment, especially among younger Iranians who see sacrifice demanded without representation or relief. When protests spread despite arrests, beatings, and information suppression, it tells me the regime's internal security calculus is failing. Western media often frame these events as episodic unrest. That framing is comforting, but wrong. From an intelligence perspective, this is a stress test of regime resilience. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was designed to suppress exactly this kind of challenge. The fact that unrest continues despite its presence suggests limits that analysts have long ignored. Dismissing these protests as manageable is how intelligence failures begin by mistaking inconvenience for irrelevance and noise for absence of threat. One of the most persistent analytical errors I see in Western intelligence and media coverage of Iran is the assumption that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps represents an all-seeing, all-controlling internal security machine. That belief is comforting to policymakers because it suggests stability, predictability, and the absence of surprise. It is also wrong. The IRGC is powerful, but it is not omnipotent, and more importantly, it was never designed to manage sustained, nationwide social unrest without cost. The IRGC's internal security role rests on layered intimidation, surveillance, informants, rapid reaction units, and selective brutality. That system works well when dissent is localized, leaderless, and episodic. It breaks down when unrest becomes dispersed, repetitive, and socially normalized. What I am seeing now are signs that repression is no longer restoring deterrence. Arrests are not stopping demonstrations. Internet shutdowns are not preventing mobilization. Symbolic violence against regime imagery is spreading, not receding. Those are classic indicators that fear is no longer functioning as intended. There is also a structural problem analysts rarely acknowledge. The IRGC is not a monolith. It is a complex organization with competing interests, economic stakes, and generational divides. Units tasked with foreign operations are not optimized for domestic crowd control. Basij auxiliaries can suppress protests, but only up to a point, and only if they believe the regime's survival is unquestioned. When unrest persists despite visible force, morale becomes a variable, not a constant. Intelligence failures often begin when analysts assume loyalty is automatic rather than contingent. Another misreading concerns scale. Containing unrest in Tehran is one thing. Managing simultaneous protests across dozens of cities, including smaller provincial centers, is another. That requires manpower, logistics, and sustained political will. Every deployment inward is a deployment not available elsewhere. From an intelligence perspective, that creates trade-offs the regime cannot escape. The more the IRGC focuses on internal repression, the more it exposes its external commitments as vulnerabilities rather than strength. What concerns me most is how Western intelligence assessments tend to interpret the regime's continued survival as proof of control. Survival is a low bar. Authoritarian systems can endure long after their coercive mechanisms begin to fray. The relevant question is not whether the IRGC can crush protests today, but whether it can do so repeatedly without accelerating long-term decay. History shows that security forces rarely collapse suddenly. They erode, fracture, and miscalculate. The hard lesson here is that control is not binary. It is a spectrum, and Iran is sliding along it in a dangerous direction. Treating the IRGC as an infallible stabilizer blinds analysts to early warning signs of deeper regime stress. That blindness is how intelligence communities miss inflection points until they have already passed. When analysts talk about Iran's economy, they tend to frame it as background context rather than an operational variable. That is a mistake. Economic collapse does not merely cause discontent. It amplifies every existing fault line inside a political system. In intelligence terms, it acts as a force multiplier. What Iran is experiencing now is not a temporary downturn, but a prolonged erosion of economic credibility, and that erosion is feeding directly into political instability. Iran's currency depreciation has been steady and severe. Inflation has hollowed out wages, destroyed savings, and made daily life unpredictable for ordinary citizens. These are not abstract indicators. In intelligence assessments, sustained inflation correlates strongly with protest persistence because it removes the regime's ability to placate dissent through marginal concessions. When prices rise faster than any subsidy or cash payment, the population quickly recognizes symbolic relief for what it is, an admission of failure. Emergency stipends do not restore confidence, they signal desperation. Sanctions are often cited as the primary cause, and while they matter, that explanation is incomplete. Sanctions constrain options, but mismanagement compounds the damage. Iran's leadership has prioritized strategic projection and patronage networks over domestic resilience. From an intelligence standpoint, that choice has consequences. Economic systems under strain can survive if citizens believe sacrifice serves a purpose. That belief has eroded. What I see now is a population that no longer accepts external confrontation as justification for internal hardship. This matters because economic pressure changes protest dynamics. People protesting ideology can be isolated and discredited. People protesting survival cannot. When teachers, pensioners, merchants, and industrial workers join demonstrations or strikes, repression becomes riskier. Security forces are trained to confront activists, not entire economic classes. That distinction is critical and often ignored in Western reporting. The regime's attempts to manage this through coercion and narrative control reveal the depth of the problem. Currency crises undermine trust not just in leadership, but in the future. Once that trust is gone, the state's promises lose their binding power. Intelligence services track this through behavior, not rhetoric. Increased strikes, refusal to disperse, and the willingness to absorb punishment all point to a population that no longer believes compliance will improve its condition. The hard lesson is that economic collapse does not trigger regime change by itself, but it removes the buffers that prevent political shocks from cascading. Iran is operating without those buffers now. Analysts who treat the economy as a side issue are missing how it accelerates every other source of instability. This is how states enter periods of chronic unrest, not with a single explosion, but with sustained pressure that no longer responds to traditional control mechanisms. When a government shuts down the internet, it is not exercising strength. It is revealing fear, I have seen this pattern repeatedly from authoritarian states convinced that controlling information can substitute for solving underlying problems. In Iran's case, recurring internet blackouts during periods of unrest are among the clearest indicators that the regime believes it is losing narrative control. Intelligence professionals understand that information denial is a defensive measure, not a strategy. The Iranian leadership understands how modern protest movements function. Mobilization no longer depends on centralized leadership or formal organizations. It spreads horizontally through social networks, encrypted messaging, and visual proof. Videos of security forces firing on demonstrators or of crowds defying authority travel faster than any official statement. Cutting connectivity is an attempt to slow that spread and isolate protest cells from one another. But it also confirms to the population that the state is reacting, not shaping events. From an intelligence standpoint, repeated blackouts signal a loss of confidence in internal stability. If leadership believed protests were manageable, it would allow information flow and rely on targeted repression. Broad shutdowns indicate concern that unrest could synchronize across regions. That synchronization risk is what regimes fear most, because it transforms localized dissent into a national movement. Iran's leadership knows this, and its actions betray that knowledge. There is also a cost analysts often underestimate. Information blackouts disrupt commerce, logistics, and essential services. They hurt small businesses, financial transactions, and daily coordination. Every shutdown deepens economic damage and reinforces public anger. Intelligence assessments must account for second-order effects, and here they are, significant. The cure worsens the disease. Each blackout convinces more Iranians that the state views them not as citizens, but as threats to be managed. Narrative control efforts further expose vulnerability. State media emphasizes foreign plots, external agitators, and national security threats. That messaging has diminishing returns. Populations experiencing daily hardship do not accept abstract enemies as explanations forever. When narrative discipline requires suppressing reality rather than interpreting it, intelligence integrity collapses. Analysts inside the system begin shaping reports to fit leadership expectations. That is how regimes blind themselves. What I see in Iran is not effective information warfare, but defensive censorship. It delays coordination, but does not eliminate intent. Once protests resume after connectivity is restored, they often intensify, fueled by accumulated grievances and shared experiences. Intelligence history is clear on this point. Suppressing information does not erase discontent. It concentrates it. The hard lesson is that information control is a symptom of regime insecurity. States confident in their legitimacy tolerate scrutiny. States that fear exposure retreat into silence. Iran's repeated blackouts tell me the leadership understands the depth of its problem, even if it refuses to acknowledge it publicly. One of the most consistent analytical blind spots in Western assessments of Iran is the assumption that external influence equals internal strength. From an intelligence perspective, that assumption reverses causality. Iran's extensive regional commitments are not proof of resilience. They are sources of strain. Maintaining proxy networks, funding militias, and sustaining forward deterrence postures require resources, discipline, and domestic consent. Iran is running short on all three. The Islamic Republic has invested heavily in projecting power across the region, particularly in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. These operations were designed to create strategic depth and deter direct confrontation. They succeeded tactically, but they imposed long-term costs that analysts rarely integrate into internal stability assessments. Money spent sustaining foreign militias is money not spent stabilizing the domestic economy. Casualties incurred abroad erode legitimacy at home, especially when economic conditions deteriorate. From an intelligence standpoint, external commitments become liabilities when domestic control weakens. Security forces cannot be everywhere at once. Command attention is finite. When unrest expands internally, leaders are forced to choose between outward projection and inward repression. That trade-off is unavoidable. The more Iran commits resources to maintaining regional leverage, the less flexibility it has to manage internal dissent. Conversely, redeploying attention inward risks signaling weakness externally. Either option carries cost. This tension is visible in Iranian decision making. Diplomatic outreach, calibrated restraint, and ambiguous signaling are often framed as strategic patience. I see them as risk management under pressure. When domestic unrest rises, regimes become cautious abroad, not because they desire peace, but because they fear escalation they cannot absorb. Intelligence officers are trained to watch for this linkage. It is subtle but consistent. What complicates matters further is public perception. Many Iranians increasingly question why national resources are devoted to foreign theaters while living standards collapse at home. That resentment does not require ideological opposition to be destabilizing. It only requires the belief that leadership priorities are misaligned with public welfare. Once that belief takes hold, repression becomes less effective because it is no longer perceived as protecting national security, but as enforcing elite preferences. Western narratives often portray Iran's regional posture as aggressive confidence. That interpretation flatters the regime and obscures vulnerability. Overextension is a classic precursor to strategic failure. Empires and revolutionary states alike have discovered that sustaining influence abroad while neglecting legitimacy at home is a losing proposition. The hard lesson here is that power projection drains internal cohesion when economic and social foundations are weak. Iran's regional footprint magnifies domestic stress rather than compensating for it. Analysts who treat external operations as independent of internal stability are missing how strategic ambition can accelerate internal decay. If there is one constant I have observed over decades of intelligence work, it is Washington's tendency to see what it wants to see. Iran is no exception. U.S. intelligence assessments have repeatedly underestimated internal regime stress because they are filtered through policy preferences rather than disciplined analysis. When the dominant policy objective is managing escalation or preserving diplomatic options, intelligence that suggests instability becomes inconvenient. Inconvenient intelligence is often sidelined, softened, or reframed. The prevailing narrative in Washington has long portrayed Iran as internally resilient, tightly controlled, and fundamentally stable despite sanctions and unrest. That narrative serves multiple bureaucratic interests. It reassures allies, supports deterrence doctrines, and avoids difficult questions about long-term strategy. But intelligence is not supposed to reassure, it is supposed to warn. When warning conflicts with policy comfort, the system defaults to comfort. One of the most damaging distortions comes from mirror imaging. Analysts assume that because the Iranian regime has survived past crises, it will survive future ones unchanged. That logic ignores cumulative degradation. Regimes do not reset after each protest cycle. They absorb damage. Legitimacy erodes incrementally. Coercive capacity degrades under repeated use. Intelligence failures occur when analysts treat survival as proof of health rather than mere endurance. Media amplification compounds the problem. Simplified narratives about hardliners versus reformers or negotiations versus confrontation obscure the structural decay beneath surface politics. Intelligence consumers begin to believe that managing elite factions equals managing stability. It does not. Popular legitimacy and elite maneuvering are related but distinct variables. Confusing them leads to strategic miscalculation. There is also an institutional bias toward state-centric indicators. Military readiness, missile inventories, proxy activity. These are measurable and familiar. Social cohesion, fear, erosion, and public defiance are harder to quantify and easier to dismiss. Yet history shows that states rarely collapse because their militaries fail first. They collapse because their societies disengage. Intelligence that ignores that dynamic is incomplete by definition. What troubles me most is how often warning signs are reframed as resilience. Internet shutdowns become proof of control. Arrests become evidence of effectiveness. Continued repression becomes stability. This inversion of logic is not accidental. It reflects a system more comfortable with continuity than disruption. Intelligence officers who challenge that framing risk marginalization. The hard lesson is that Washington's blind spot is self-inflicted. When intelligence becomes subordinate to narrative management, it stops functioning as an early warning system. Iran's internal stress is not a speculative theory, it is observable reality. Ignoring it does not make it disappear. It only ensures that when change comes, it will be misread, mishandled, or both. After decades inside the intelligence world, I have learned that the most dangerous failures rarely come from missing information. They come from refusing to accept what the information is already saying. Iran's current unrest fits that pattern precisely. The indicators are visible, recurring, and mutually reinforcing. Yet the dominant analytical posture still treats them as manageable disturbances rather than as evidence of structural strain. That is not a gap in data. It is a failure of judgment. The lesson intelligence communities resist is that regimes do not need to be on the brink of collapse to become strategically unreliable. Internal stress degrades decision-making long before it produces regime change. Leaders under pressure prioritize survival over strategy. They become reactive, risk-averse in some arenas, reckless in others. Signals grow inconsistent. Deterrence becomes noisy. From an intelligence standpoint, this is the most dangerous phase because external actors misinterpret caution as weakness and repression as control. Iran is operating in that space now. The regime is neither stable nor collapsing. It is absorbing pressure while losing elasticity. Each protest cycle leaves residue, more resentment, more distrust, more normalized defiance. Security forces can suppress symptoms, but they cannot reverse trajectory without restoring legitimacy. Intelligence professionals know legitimacy cannot be manufactured through force or subsidies. It is earned through credibility, and credibility once lost is difficult to regain. What makes this especially concerning is how external actors, particularly Washington, continue to anchor strategy to outdated assumptions. Policies built on the belief that Iran is internally cohesive and indefinitely controllable are brittle. They assume rational, centralized decision-making in a system increasingly driven by fear and factional survival. When intelligence analysis ignores that shift, it misguides policy at precisely the moment clarity is most needed. I am not predicting imminent revolution. Intelligence work is not prophecy. What I am identifying is regime stress that alters behavior and increases miscalculation risk. History is unambiguous on this point. States under sustained internal pressure are more prone to error, not less. They lash out, overreact, or misread external signals because internal coherence is compromised. Analysts who wait for collapse before adjusting assessments are always too late. The final hard lesson is this: intelligence is supposed to tell uncomfortable truths early, not confirm reassuring narratives late. Iran's protests are not isolated events. They are signals of a system under strain that repression alone cannot resolve. Ignoring those signals does not preserve stability. It guarantees surprise. And in intelligence, surprise is the one outcome professionals are supposed to prevent.